Hello, I'm Tom Dozier, and this video is the Misophonic reflex response. Let's talk about the reflex that is in misophonia. And the popular view of this misophonic response or reflex is that I hear a trigger or I see it, and boom, there's these extreme emotions, right? I mean, it's just jerked out of you. It's involuntary. It's yanked out of you. And it's not a thoughtful behavior. It's just an immediate reflex. It is something that you don't have at birth, so I would say that means it makes it acquired, meaning you've developed it, or it's developed. And you hear this trigger, and boom, there's the emotion, and that's the popular view. Now, what I have found from working with people over the past almost 2 years now is that there's a hidden physical reflex, and that you hear the trigger and there's a boom physical reflex, and it's small and the emotion overpowers you, so you don't really notice the physical reflex. It's involuntary. It's not a thoughtful behavior. It's a reflex. It is acquired. It's developed through life, and so you hear the trigger, boom, this physical reflex, and that's controlled by your lizard brain, your autonomic nervous system is what's really doing this. Now, there's quite a bit of diversity in this physical reflex. About 90 to 95% of the people that I work with, after we work together, can identify a physical reflex. A lot of them say at first, no, I simply have rage. But when we get into a treatment setting, or we get it calmed down and do a test with a weak trigger, then most of those people can identify the reflex. In fact, I had one girl who said she had no reflex at all. She simply had rage. And yet during the treatment of this very, very small trigger, where, by the way, there was no emotion, it was just a physical reflex, you could see her shoulders were jerking. And she identified the muscle jerk herself after when we finished and we talked to her about it. But it can be any muscle: neck, shoulders, chest, jaw, face, hands open, hands closed, your arms, abs, legs, butt, any kind of combination seemingly. I've kind of seen. And then internal reflexes: stomach constriction, intestine constriction, nausea, esophagus constriction, sexual arousal. And I had one person say the only thing they could determine was an increased heart rate. Not sure that was actually the physical reflex, but it could have been. Could have been getting a little shot of hormones there. So to determine this initial physical reflex, you have to do a science experiment. And what you have to do is get very relaxed and then hear a very small trigger. And to make it a small trigger, typically it needs to be short and quiet. And if it's a visual trigger, then you would for sure probably have to do that with a video recording. With a sound trigger, maybe you can do it from another room, or possibly even with a visual trigger from a distance to make it a smaller trigger to you. You can also use audio recording and vary the length of time that the trigger is going to play and the volume. The Trigger Tamer app is very good for doing this. The current version is hard to record, but we're about to release a version that will make it very easy to record the trigger and then test your reflex with it. But you want to get it very short, less than a half second, and then barely audible, and then you slowly bring up the volume until you start to trigger. And at that point, you should be able to determine where in your body it's jerking. Sometimes the reflex can't be described clearly. One person said their heart bumped. It didn't have an increased heart rate. It's just a single bump. And there was another muscle jerk that person had. Sometimes a person said, well, one person said it's something like something's growing in my chest. I can't describe it better than that. One person said their body was full of electrified jelly beans. Another person I worked with who didn't think she had a physical reflex And she had actually tested herself looking for the physical reflex, and there was no response. And as she was using the trigger tamer, getting that ready, she noticed the muscles behind her ears jerking. And she tested herself, and lo and behold, when she heard her little trigger, those muscles behind her ears jerked. And so that was her physical reflex. Had another person who didn't think they had a physical reflex, but they went to a doctor that I work with, and in the treatment process, the doctor had to trigger the person, and he could see a jerk in an eye muscle. He named the specific muscle. And these reflexes can be very uncomfortable. One woman described it as a shovel being run through her chest and out her back. So she couldn't describe which muscle, but boy, she sure felt it in there. Now, what I see misophonia, Tom's view, is that misophonia is really a two-step process. Step one is I hear this trigger stimulus, and I have this aversive reflex, this physical aversive reflex. Step two is I have this aversive reflex, and I have extreme emotions as a response to that reflex. And I find that with working with patients, I find that their physical reflex is consistent with the body of research on reflexes. So it really does look like this is an acquired physical reflex. It's just a very aversive physical reflex. Now, how about the emotional response? Well, you can't feel electricity, but if you've been shocked, you felt something. And what you felt was muscle constriction, that the electricity makes you tighten your muscles. And that is uncomfortable. And we know that muscle movement, the reason our muscles move, is from our brain. It sends out electrical impulses that causes our muscles to constrict. So when that lizard brain of yours perceives the trigger, it sends out an electrical shock, and like, ah! And it literally is a shock to you. And the emotional response to aversive events is really consistent with research. It's an assault on your body. And it's that physical assault produces the strong emotions. Now, you've probably been told that anger is a choice. Is it with misophonia? You know, a person can't make you angry unless you let them. Not true with misophonia. With misophonia, anger is not a choice. It is jerked out of you. And the reason I believe that you cannot stay calm is that with this physical reflex, it is an assault on you. You are being physically assaulted, but you're being assaulted by your little lizard brain. The sound comes into the brain, it's perceived by that lizard brain, and it zaps you. Now, this miso anger, the anger to a physical assault, is consistent with research also. And in fact, I didn't do this, so don't blame me, but the research was done with mice in an electrical cage where you could shock the floor and shock them, and when they're shocked, they would turn and attack each other. And essentially, you're getting zapped or whacked, and that produces this jerked out of you anger response, and the emotions are so enormous and huge that the shock itself is almost imperceptible in many people. Now, there's some benefits from knowing your reflex. So if you understand that with misophonia, your lizard brain is hurting you, not the other person, that helps. Right? It's a reflex. It's a different way of looking at misophonia, that it's that little reflex you've got. Stopping the physical reflex stops the emotion. That's what I've seen with this neural repatterning technique treatment, and most of the people who have been positive responders to the treatment have found that in the treatment they do not have emotion. They can feel that twitch, but it's at a low level, so it doesn't jerk the emotion out of them. And that when you stop the physical reflex, the emotions don't happen. Now, I do have one person who's responded extremely well to the neural repatterning technique, and she's done some videos for me talking about that, and she's had an emotional and a physical response when she was doing the neural repatterning technique, the trigger taming. And she would adjust the trigger down low to keep the emotion under control. And then with time, the emotion went away and the physical response went away together. Now, there's another really great reason to know your physical reflex, and that is because of what we can do with progressive muscle relaxation to use that as a treatment, and I'll cover that in another video. But if you know your reflex, then we can use progressive muscle relaxation to help you. So thank you for watching this video, the Misophonic reflex response. If it's been of value to you, we'd appreciate a donation to the Misophonia Treatment Institute. We'll use that money for education, for misophonia awareness, for research, and for developing treatments for misophonia. So thank you very much.